The richest girl in America walked down the aisle in tears, her wedding veil hiding her swollen eyes as she married a man she didn't love. The year was 1895, and Consuelo Vanderbilt had just been sold to a duke for $10 million, about $350 million in today's money, all because her mother wanted a royal title in the family. So, yeah, subscribe for more stories, and I always wonder, where are you right now? What time is it? Drop it in the comments. Someone from Brussels said they listen on their lunch break and someone from San Francisco was going to bed. Same video, totally different days. Alright, tonight we're heading back to the Gilded Age, but before we go anywhere, get comfortable. Like properly comfortable. Pillows fluffed, blanket situation handled, perfect. Where we're going, you're gonna want to be cozy. The year is 1877. You've just woken up in the grandest mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The sheets beneath you aren't just silk, they're the finest Chinese silk money can buy. The ceiling above you soars 30 feet high, painted with cherubs and clouds that cost more than most people's homes. The walls are lined with tapestries from medieval France, and the fireplace could roast an entire cow. But despite all this luxury, there's something wrong. Your back aches from the steel rod strapped down your spine. It runs from your neck to your tailbone with another rod across your forehead. You're 10 years old, and this torture device isn't punishment, it's training. Because your mother has decided that your posture must be perfect, your legs twitch with pain throughout the night, but you don't dare complain. The servants call it the Vanderbilt Fidgets, as if even your discomfort should have a fancy name. This is life for young Consuelo Vanderbilt, and every morning begins the same way. A maid arrives to unbuckle the contraption, and only then can you breathe freely. But the relief is temporary, because the day's lessons are about to begin. Sit up straighter, her mother snaps, rapping Consuelo's knuckles with a wooden ruler. A proper lady never slouches. Consuelo is the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, heir to the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune, the richest family in America, possibly the world. But in this house, money means nothing compared to the ambitions of her mother, Alva. Imagine being the richest girl in America and having absolutely no freedom. Weird, right? Like having a golden cage that's still, well, a cage. "Do you know what your problem is?" Alva says to her daughter one morning at breakfast. "The silverware is so heavy it requires actual effort to lift it to your mouth. Your nose is too sharp, and your posture is still atrocious despite everything I've done." Now, if your mum said this to you today, you'd probably be in therapy until you died. But for Consuelo, this was Tuesday. "I don't ask you to think," her mother once told her. "I do the thinking. You do as you're told." And what Alva was thinking about, constantly, obsessively, was how to marry her daughter to European royalty. Each morning, Consuelo joins the Rosa classes, an elite group of half a dozen girls from the right families, educated in private rooms rather than common schools. They study Latin, literature, mathematics, manners, music, and French dictation. They read Milton and Virgil while carriages rumble past outside. The girls learn to nod at the right questions and never ask their own. Consuelo's voice, when she's allowed to use it, is described as graceful. Her walk is measured in inches. When she sits perfectly upright, whether for a lesson, a luncheon, or the half hour allotted each day for speaking with her mother. Words are weighed, topics are rehearsed, reactions are managed. "Do you know why we're doing all this?" Alva asks one day, adjusting Consuelo's hair with painful precision. Consuelo stays silent. She's learned that most questions from her mother are traps, because one day you will be a duchess, maybe even a queen, and when that happens, you'll thank me for every lesson, every correction, every moment of discipline. But beneath her silent exterior, Consuelo has a secret world. Books. While her body is being shaped into something ornamental, her mind moves at speed. In French, German and English, she devours history and legend. She memorizes La Fontaine and Faust and writes essays on the Punic Wars. She dreams not of gowns or invitations, but of Sparta, of Joan of Arc, of heroines who survived on wit and will alone. She admires women who resisted, women who led, women who heard voices no one else believed. And at night she invents voices of her own, whispered rebellions in the quiet dark. Her younger brother Willie is her partner in rare moments of joy. They ride across the estate's pond, chase frogs, and once upend their governess into the water, laughing until they're caught. At home, they're punished. Willie cries. Consuelo does not. There are moments of unexpected kindness. Her nurse, Bua, offers what no one else does, gentleness. It's Bua who brings her to visit the daughter of a groundskeeper, a girl her own age, paralyzed, bedridden, without even a doll to hold. No pearls, no portraits, just stillness. How much I owe to Bua, Consuelo would later write. It was from her I learned the happiness helping others brings. Even then, even as a child, she begins to question what it means to be rich and what it means to be free. At night, she climbs the grand staircase alone to her room. The gas lamps behind her dim, the walls creak and sigh, shadows slip between the banisters like hands. And in that long, silent ascent, she whispers the only prayer she knows by heart. Courage. Give me courage to reach the top and one day perhaps to escape it. Not the house, not the family, but the fate waiting at the end of the hallway. By 17, Consuelo Vanderbilt is nearly as tall as her mother, though still careful not to rise too fast. Her limbs have stretched into elegance, her features lengthened with promise, but her silence remains. She has learned early that to grow is not the same as to become. Growth can be controlled. Becoming is dangerous. In the spring of 1894, Consuelo is taken abroad to Egypt, to Athens, to the temples of India. The yacht Valiant shimmers through foreign harbours, its linen awnings snapping in the wind. At every port there are dignitaries and receptions, letters of introduction, and lectures on imperial grandeur. Consuelo sees the Nile, the Parthenon, the Ganges. She sees women in saris, in veils, in sun-bleached rags. She sees poverty and ceremony, shrines and deserts, and realizes something quietly terrifying. She has seen more of the world than most women ever would, and yet she has touched none of it. Her days are plotted. Her company is curated. And then something unexpected happens. A man. His name is Winthrop Rutherford. Handsome, discreet, American. The sort of gentleman who doesn't need to prove anything because he doesn't need to take anything. He is no fortune hunter, no title seeker, no European aristocrat in debt to his wallpaper. He is simply kind. He meets her without guards, speaks to her without calculation, listens. "What books do you enjoy?" he asks her one afternoon, and for a moment she's stunned. No one has ever asked her opinion on something so personal. I enjoy Dickens," she says carefully, watching for the trap. "Especially the orphans." "The orphans?" He seems genuinely curious, not judging. "They're allowed to want things," she says, surprising herself with her honesty. "The poor children in his books have more freedom than the rich ones, don't you think?" He doesn't laugh at her. He doesn't correct her. He considers her words as if they matter. They exchange books, walk in gardens, speak in corners, and when he asks quietly, nervously, sincerely if she would one day marry him, she says yes. She has chosen something for the first time in her life. It is secret. It is sacred. It is hers. We'll announce it soon, she thinks. Or elope if they have to. He will follow her home. She will face her mother. Perhaps there will be shouting, perhaps worse. But after that, after one long storm, will come peace. It is her one true act of defiance, but Alva already knows. Letters stop arriving, friends stop calling, doors close in subtle, synchronized succession. Her governess refuses to speak of him. A footman is dismissed. Her social calendar is revised. Her father, distant as ever, says nothing, but her mother has made her position clear. You will not marry that man. Consuelo tries to explain, to plead. She is met with silence, then fury, and then weakness. Alva faints, claims to have heart palpitations. A doctor is called. She lies in bed for days, eyes shut, refusing broth, her voice growing thin and tragic. You'll kill me, she whispers. You'll bring shame to this family. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. Consuelo, terrified, believes it. If her mother dies, it will be her fault. Her selfishness will have killed her. Winthrop Rutherford, for all his strength, cannot enter her house. His letters are intercepted. His name is blackened in society. She can neither speak to him nor speak of him. And finally, one afternoon when the lamps are being lit and her mother's room reeks of lavender and crisis, Consuelo surrenders. Tell him I can't, she says. She never sees him again. Instead, she is told she will marry the Duke of Marlborough. His name is Charles. His nickname is Sonny, though not because of any pleasant disposition. Rather, it's from his secondary title, Earl of Sunderland. 6 years older than Consuelo, pale, thin-lipped, with fine hands and a fine opinion of them, the Duke carries the bearing of 10 generations of English blood and several centuries of unpaid debt. Blenheim Palace, his ancestral seat, has been a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough, built to glorify war and now quietly crumbling into its own past. The roof leaks, the staff is unpaid, but the name still glitters in Alva's mind like a crown. What he needs is money. What Alva needs is a title. What Consuelo needs no longer matters. She agrees, not from hope, but from exhaustion. Not out of love, but because she has run out of choices. She is 17. Her real engagement has been erased. Her imagined rebellion has nearly killed her mother. What else is there? The announcement is immediate. The press explodes. Her face appears in papers across 2 continents. Her hair colour, her chin shape. She is catalogued and debated. Some reports call her the richest bride in the world. Others mock her as America's latest export, the dollar princess. She's measured like livestock but in florals. The New York World reports, age 18 years, chin pointed, indicating vivacity, nose slightly retroussé, waist 20 inches, marriage settlement $10 million. She is described like a museum piece, slender of hand, elegant of gait, obedient of bearing. People call it a fairy tale, a triumph. The union of America's wealth with Britain's pedigree, a Vanderbilt duchess, a palace renewed. No one mentions the man she has loved. No one asks if she is happy. On the morning of November 6th, 1895, New York City blooms with opera glasses. By 9 a.m., thousands have gathered outside Alva's new mansion on 72nd Street, shoulder to shoulder, necks craned toward the windows. By 10, police have roped off the block. By 11, while Fifth Avenue is a wall of carriages. Inside St. Thomas Church, an orchestra plays Wagner. Reporters sharpen metaphors. She is not late, she is hiding. Upstairs, behind a locked door, Consuelo Vanderbilt sits alone in her wedding gown, her face swollen from crying. Her corset digs into her ribs. Her gloves lie in her lap like folded wings. The veil, yards of tulle and embroidery, spills off her shoulders like fog. She has tried not to cry, but the tears come anyway. 20 minutes pass. Below, the Duke shifts on the altar. Guests murmur. Ushers panic. The orchestra keeps playing. She has considered running. That morning, before the maids arrived with breakfast, she had stared at the street and wondered what would happen if she simply disappeared into the crowd, walked into the park, caught a train, escaped. But where would she go? Winthrop is gone. Her father is silent. Her mother has recovered. And the world, this great echoing world, is watching. Years later, Alva would become a crusader for women's suffrage. She would stand on podiums and speak of liberty. But the first vote her daughter ever cast was this: to betray her own heart. So she stands. A footman opens the door. Another fixes her train. The veil is lowered over her face, the tears tucked beneath it. The bells ring. Outside, the crowd surges. Inside, the floral arches drip with roses and chrysanthemums, lilies and ivy sweeping from gallery to nave. Palm leaves tremble in the heat of the gaslight. The doors open and Consuelo walks forward. No one can see her face. No one can hear her breathing. But she can hear everything. Every shoe scuff, every cough, every whisper. She has no bouquet. It has not arrived. Her father walks beside her, beautiful, distant. The church is a dreamscape of wealth and spectacle. 1,400 guests, 60 musicians, 50 choristers, 2 bishops, and not a single escape route. She has not run. That is all the world needs to know. She reaches the altar, says the vows, hears her name changed, and somewhere in the applause that follows, the girl who had once whispered courage with each step on the staircase is replaced by someone else. The Duchess of Marlborough has arrived. She has not married a man. She has married a dynasty. Unlike your warm bed right now with its soft sheets and personal choice of pillows, Consuelo is stepping into a life where every moment will be dictated by tradition and protocol, where every breath will be watched, every word weighed, every action judged. As she walks back down the aisle, now on the arm of her new husband, she passes her mother. Alva smiles triumphantly. She has won. Her daughter is a duchess. And Consuelo, she is thinking of something her nurse Brewer once told her. The finest cages are still cages, my dear, and the birds inside them still dream of flight. As the carriage pulls away from the church, surrounded by cheering crowds, the new Duchess of Marlborough stares out the window at the city she is leaving behind. And though her face is composed, though her posture is perfect, inside she is asking herself a question that will haunt her for years to come. What is the price of a title, and is any crown worth the weight it places on your head? She doesn't know it yet, but this wedding day is not the end of her story. It is merely the beginning, and though she enters her marriage as an ornament, a possession, a prize, she will one day find a way to become something else entirely. Not a duchess, not a dollar princess, but a woman who shapes her own fate. The carriage disappears into the crowd, and for now Consuelo Vanderbilt has vanished too, buried beneath the title, the expectations, and the glitter of a world that values wealth above happiness and position above love. But somewhere beneath it all, the girl who once prayed for courage still whispers in the dark. There was no honeymoon, not in the romantic sense, no seclusion, no sunlit journey into shared intimacy. What followed the wedding was a week at Idlehour, the Vanderbilt estate on Long Island, familiar and stately but drained of warmth, 2 near strangers inhabiting a single tableau. She wore the title. He wore indifference. They dined in silence, took tea, and practiced civility. At night, she retired alone. Like a deserted child, she would later write, I longed for my family. I faced life beside a stranger within a world I could not reach. Then came the voyage across the Atlantic. There were few ocean liners to Italy in those days, only cargo ships. They boarded a vessel suited for freight and brine, not for brides. The Duke was ill during the crossing, physically sick and emotionally absent. She nursed him quietly, without complaint. The captain offered no courtesies. There was no doctor aboard. The sea was rough. The journey felt longer than the Atlantic deserved. Picture this. You're stuck on a rocking ship for days with a man who basically bought you and he's puking his guts out while you hold the bucket. Not exactly the fairy tale they promised, right? They arrived in Europe in the dead of winter. The continent greeted them with icy winds and colourless skies. They visited cathedrals where Madonnas wore ermine capes and golden crowns, their eyes staring out beneath jewelled lashes. She was unsettled by the spectacle of grief, religion draped in velvet and pain, but dared not speak it aloud. It was in Rome that her body failed her. She fell ill, exhausted, pale, and weak. A Roman doctor, summoned in haste, offered a diagnosis with the unflinching calm of a priest delivering last rites. 6 months, he told her, perhaps a year. She was 18. And now, perhaps, dying. It was not death that terrified her. It was the idea that her life had not yet begun. I was beginning to chafe, she wrote, at the impersonal role I had so far played in my own life. In truth, the diagnosis was wrong. A second physician corrected it, but the emotional reality remained. She had lived so long in silence that even death seemed impersonal. They continued to Paris. There, in the salons of Worth and Doucet, her trousseau was completed under her husband's supervision. He insisted on grandeur, not grace. Pink velvet gowns trimmed in sable, blue satin with ostrich feathers, jewels were selected, gloves matched to gowns, a diamond dog collar so tight it chafed her throat, a tiara so heavy it gave her migraines. She did not choose. She complied. She had been told not to draw attention to herself, but now she was being shaped into a creature meant to be looked at. You represent Blenheim now, the Duke told her while examining a necklace around her throat. You must never appear less than magnificent. And what if I prefer simplicity? She asked. He looked at her as if she'd suggested wearing a potato sack to dinner. No wife of mine will ever be simple. She understood then that she wasn't a wife. She was a display case for his wealth, her family's wealth to be precise. The arrival in London was as ceremonial as a state function and just as impersonal. Carriages, a receiving line, stiff introductions. She met her husband's relatives, who were also her new judges, the Churchill-Hamilton clan. There was Lady Sarah Wilson, all hard angles and louder opinions. There was Winston, just beginning his political rise. Lady Randolph Churchill, the former Jenny Jerome, another American who had once struggled under the weight of English titles, offered a brief smile of solidarity. The rest smiled politely. No one asked if she was well. They simply observed her, assessed her. They saw not a girl, but a duchess. They did not like Americans. They had never liked Jenny, but they liked American money. She said nothing, smiled gracefully, learned how to vanish inside a room. Then came Blenheim. You know those dreams where you're walking down endless hallways that keep stretching out in front of you? That was Blenheim Palace, except you never wake up. They entered the gates beneath a stone arch. A porter in powdered livery greeted them with a silver-topped wand. Her new home emerged from the mist like a Roman ruin born in the age of kings. The palace rose from the Oxfordshire woods like a fortress carved from golden stone. Its windows, hundreds of them, watched her without blinking. Blenheim always impressed one by its immense size and beauty, she later wrote, but at the cost of intimacy. It had been built by decree of Queen Anne, a palace not of love but of victory, a reward for war. The rooms were vast, the staircases long, portraits of dead dukes lined the halls like reminders of duty. There were salons meant for hundreds, fireplaces that roared into silence, a long gallery of books that no one read. She was shown to her chambers by servants who did not meet her gaze. Her trunks were unpacked, her bed turned down. The house was ready. She was not. One of the maids paused while arranging her dresses. "Is it true, Your Grace," the young woman whispered, "that in America houses have machines that keep them warm without fires?" "Yes," Consuelo replied. "They're called central heating systems." The maid's eyes widened. "That sounds like magic." "No," Consuelo smiled sadly. "Just progress." The Duke kept to himself. He was polite, measured, reserved. He complimented her posture once at breakfast. He mentioned the weather. He praised the staff. He had been raised not to love, but to preserve. "I married you," he told her over dinner one night, about a month after their arrival, "to save Blenheim." She looked at him across the 12 feet of mahogany table that separated them. "I know," she said simply. "Then you understand your role?" "I believe so." "Good. Your American sentimentality would be wasted here." He never touched her, not in affection, not in intimacy. They shared dinners, appearances, obligations, not life. There were no shared stories, no private jokes, no warmth. She had exchanged one form of silence for another. She learned her duties quickly. She curtsied. She received guests. She dined with duchesses and lords and ambassadors. She was presented at court. Her dresses were perfect, her English refined, her posture impeccable. She had become what was required. "I became," she would write, "the ornament to a house built for someone else's triumph." She became admired in public and unacknowledged in private. There was no rebellion. There was only routine. She was praised for her grace. She was admired for her modesty. And no one noticed she was disappearing. Outdoors, the landscape offered a different kind of silence. The villagers, though deferential, were human. The children did not know how to bow properly. The old women curtsied with shaky knees. The men removed their caps but smiled with their eyes. She began to visit the schools, the hospitals, the poorhouses. There she asked questions, and for the first time in years, someone answered honestly. "How do you survive the winters here?" she asked an elderly woman whose cottage had gaps in the walls where the wind whistled through. "We don't always, Your Grace," the woman replied matter-of-factly. "Last year we lost 3 from this lane alone. The cold takes the old ones first, then the babies." Consuelo went back to the palace that night and couldn't sleep. While she lay beneath down quilts in a room with 3 fireplaces, children were freezing a mile away. The next day, she ordered coal deliveries to every cottage within walking distance of Blenheim. The Duke was away in London. She didn't ask permission. When the bills arrived, he said nothing. Perhaps he didn't notice. Perhaps he didn't care. Or perhaps, in some small way, he approved. They did not care what her waist measured. They did not care what her title was. They cared that she came, that she listened, that she remembered their names. Back at Blenheim, nothing changed. She was still expected at breakfast, still expected to smile at diplomats, host garden parties, hold her husband's arm at public events. The staff still averted their eyes. Her husband still slept in another room. Her mother, from across the sea, still sent instructions written in the language of success. She obeyed, she performed, but something had begun to stir, not loudly, not visibly, but quiet, certain, alive. "I had made a brilliant marriage," she wrote. "I had done my duty, and I was alone." Then came her first child. The labour was long, difficult, and largely private. She was attended by midwives and doctors, but her husband remained elsewhere. The palace was hushed, watchful, expectant, not for her safety, but for the lineage she carried. And when the child finally came, a boy whole and wailing, the house erupted in celebration, not for the mother, but for the future Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo lay in a darkened room while bells were rung in the surrounding villages. Telegrams flew to London. The staff drank champagne. The Duke allowed himself a rare smile. The Spencer-Churchill dynasty had its heir. The line was secured. Her body, still aching, was acknowledged briefly. "I had fulfilled my purpose," she would later write. "I had given them what they wanted." She named him John. He had her mouth, the Duke's eyes, and a crown waiting for him. She loved him with a quiet intensity that surprised her. In that vast and echoing house where every glance was managed and every word measured, he became her secret, a source of warmth in a palace of marble. Around her, Blenheim bloomed into motion. Bells rang in the village. Toasts were raised in town. The servants stepped lightly as if royalty had arrived. But upstairs, behind drawn curtains, the woman who had delivered him sat in silence, too sore to stand, too dazed to speak. She was not allowed to hold him as she wished. A nanny was installed immediately. Traditions were cited. A mother, she was told, must not spoil an heir with too much affection. He was to be seen at intervals, cared for by professionals, raised with dignity. Her love was permitted, but not her presence. "I had longed to give him the freedom I had once dreamed of for myself," she wrote, "but the rules were older than either of us." She watched him grow through doorways and formal photographs. She was told when he was teething, when he slept, when he needed a new tutor. She received updates like a guest of honour, not a mother. She complied. She smiled at parties, posed beside his cradle for portraits, and appeared on cue when the Duke summoned her. But behind the grace was something newer, a kind of pain that sharpened rather than dulled. This was no longer the pain of obedience. This was the pain of knowing what she could not give. A second son followed, Ivor. There was no pageantry this time, no bells, no telegrams, no champagne. The dynasty already had its heir. This child was reassurance, a spare in the language of aristocracy. But to Consuelo, he was not a spare, he was hers. She loved him as fiercely as she loved John, though the world required less of him and therefore allowed her slightly more. She held him longer, sat beside his cradle at night, spoke to him when no one watched. He gurgled and smiled and curled his hand around her finger, not because of a title or a future, but because she was warm and near, and for the first time she felt necessary, not to England, not to Blenheim, but to someone who had never seen a crest or a crown. "With Ivor, I was allowed something closer to motherhood," she wrote, but even then, the rules circled back. Nannies arrived, schedules resumed, the walls between mother and child reformed like frost across glass. And so she adapted again. She gave to others what she could not always give to her sons. She discovered a shelter for orphaned children tucked behind a chapel, where thin girls and threadbare urchins greeted her with wide, unpracticed curtsies. She went back the next week. Then the week after that, she learned names, asked questions, remembered details. She did not arrive in pearls and gowns. She arrived early, often without ceremony, and they began to greet her not as a duchess, but as someone who came back. "You again," a small boy with a crooked smile said to her one rainy Tuesday. "Thought you'd be too fancy for a second visit." "I'm never too fancy for truth," she replied, helping him with his letters. There was no transformation overnight, no triumphant declaration, no rebellion, just the slow-growing certainty that this was real. Not the gowns, not the dinners, not the practiced smile on a ballroom staircase, but this, a hand on a child's forehead, a name remembered, a window without a curtain. She dreamed once that she was walking through town without gloves. Her hair was loose, her arms were bare, and no one stopped her. For the first time, she would write, "I was not acting, I was present." Her husband did not notice. When the Duke began to spend more and more time in London, ostensibly for Parliament, she made no inquiry. When he returned less frequently, she made no protest. His absences, like his presence, were conducted in the language of silence. There were whispers of his affairs. Of course, society always whispered, but the whispers were not about her heartbreak. They were about her composure. She did not confront him. She knew her place. In public, her beauty became her reputation. She was praised in newspapers as the most elegant of hostesses, an ornament to the Marlborough name, a model of restraint. But by now, as with so much in Consuelo's life, the marriage had become a performance perfected. She once passed him in the corridor, he coming from one end, she from another. A footman paused and bowed to both. They nodded to one another with the grace of acquaintances at a public event. She did not remember what they said, only that they moved past each other like ghosts in daylight, acknowledged present but already fading behind them. They appeared together at court, at garden parties, at the opera. They posed side by side for portraits and waved from carriages. They spoke in clipped, cordial tones. At public dinners, he complimented her taste in flowers. She complimented his speeches. They were admired as a pair, elegant, polished, enviable. "My husband was invariably courteous," she wrote, "but there was no companionship." But at night in her room, when the candles were low and the fire had gone to embers, she would sit by the window with a book unopened in her lap, listening not for footsteps down the hall, but for her own breath. The silence no longer frightened her. It no longer meant emptiness. It meant space. And within that space, she began slowly, quietly, finally, to think. "It was in those years," she wrote later, "that I began to understand that obedience is not always virtue and silence is not always peace." She had once been made into a portrait. Now she was beginning to sketch herself. The century turned with ceremony, not revolution. Queen Victoria died in 1901, and with her an age ended, not in flames but in velvet. The mourning veils came down. The empire held its breath, and in that hush a new kind of spectacle began. On the morning of Edward VII's coronation, Consuelo stood beneath the ducal canopy, cloth of gold suspended above her head like a crown she did not wear. Her train shimmered behind her, her jewels caught the torchlight. From the choir loft, trumpets sounded, and the floor seemed to rise with sound. But she stood motionless, decorous, remote, alone. The other duchesses whispered. One glanced sideways, another adjusted her gloves without looking up. They were queens of lineage, of diamonds, of households older than history, and Consuelo stood among them as the American. "Wouldn't it be hilarious," Winston Churchill muttered beside her, "if we all just started dancing?" right now? Complete chaos. I've always wanted to see the Archbishop's face if that happened. Consuelo bit her lip to keep from smiling. Churchill always made these ceremonies bearable. She held her posture. She knew the choreography. She bowed at the proper time and retreated in step, and when the king and queen passed by, she lowered her eyes. Around her neck a collar of diamonds sat like armor, gleaming, suffocating, exquisitely heavy. A gift, a symbol, a leash. I stood beneath cloth of gold, she later wrote, and no one noticed I had disappeared. That evening they dined at the palace. The room was candle-lit and immense. Goblets gleamed, silver clinked. The king complimented the duchess's composure. She bowed her head. No one asked what she had seen. No one asked how it had felt. They asked only if the veil had caught the light. Unlike your snug bed now, where you decide when to sleep and when to rise, every moment of her day was planned, examined, judged. It's hard to imagine that level of constant scrutiny, like living in a museum where you're also an exhibit. That winter, the Marlboroughs journeyed to Russia, drawn by the grandeur of a court that glittered like legend and trembled like warning. St. Petersburg shimmered with snow and suspicion. The streets were wide but windswept, the palaces imposing but hollow. At first glance, it was splendor. At second, strain. At the Winter Palace, Consuelo wore white satin. Her tiara flashed beneath chandeliers. Scarlet footmen stood, sentinel. Mazurkas began. Grand Duke Michael took her hand and laughed when she stumbled. "Never mind," he said. "I'll do the steps." He would be executed 16 years later. At another supper, her seat was left empty. When the Tsar arrived, he filled it. "Russia is not ready for democracy," he told her softly. "We are 200 years behind Europe." He feared his ministers, feared the people, feared giving power long enough for anyone to become dangerous. Then he smiled gently at her with a wink. "I know everything you've done in Russia. The secret police send me reports." Behind the charm, the system watched. At the Hermitage, supper was served among Van Dycks and saints under flickering candlelight. A familiar tune played, "Marlbrook s'en va-t-en guerre." The Tsar smiled. She smiled back, but unease stirred. Versailles again, she thought. Everything glittered, nothing breathed. Then, in 1903, they were invited to India. Lord Curzon staged the Delhi Durbar like an imperial opera. Gun salutes, gilded elephants, guards, and golden sashes. A palace of tents shimmered in the dust. Each one had its own salon, its own bath, but privacy was fiction. At the great ball, Lady Curzon wore a gown embroidered with peacock feathers. They whispered it was bad luck. She died not long after. Consuelo waved to cheering crowds. She smiled in unbearable heat. She dined in splendor while famine-starved children watched from behind palace walls. She had been taught that empire was stability, but now she saw only shadows in the sun. Even the crowns, she wrote, were copies of something lost. At the Purda party, she met Indian princesses behind embroidered screens, luminous, poised, painted like miniatures. But to Consuelo, they felt like butterflies, beautiful, still unable to fly. One morning she joined a falcon hunt at dawn. The sun rose over the plains. The birds soared, unhooded, circling. One could dive at 150 miles per hour. One had flown from Fontainebleau to Malta in a single day. But what she remembered most was this. From a minaret she looked down into darkness. A single firework burst, and beneath it a sea of upturned faces, turbans of every shade, eyes gleaming. Not joy, it was rapture. Then on to Vienna. The city still glittered with operettas and empire. Introduced by Count Mensdorff, Consuelo entered easily. She met Emperor Franz Joseph, small, grave, heavy with grief. On Maundy Thursday, she watched him wash the feet of 12 poor men. The archdukes laid out food. It was whisked away. The gesture remained. The soul was gone. She visited the Spanish riding school, watched a groom catch a horse's waist mid-air so it wouldn't touch the floor. The Viennese laughed. She did too, but she could no longer hear the music. Her hearing had begun to vanish, not all at once, but like a ballroom filling with fog. The world had not gone silent. It had simply stopped, including her. Vienna, she thought, was a stage. The rituals survived, but the meaning had drained away. When John Singer Sargent arrived at Blenheim to paint her, he was brisk, fidgeting, always smoking. He refused to let her wear pearls, called her neck a tree trunk. Her dress was ivory satin, her posture impeccable. The boys stood beside her. The Duke wore his garter robes. Sargent worked quickly. He didn't need revision. "He captured me beautifully," she said, "but he did not find me." When the portrait was hung in the Great Hall, she looked at it the same way others did, from the outside. She returned to England with letters to answer and public events to attend. She did so perfectly. There were no scandals, no refusals. The Duchess was always present, always framed just right, but her voice had softened, her step had slowed. She was no longer performing for love or even approval, only for the preservation of the story being told around her. "I was still called the Duchess," she would write, "but I had already become someone else." Consuelo and Sonny had been married 11 years. Time hadn't softened their differences. It had sharpened them. The quiet war between two mismatched souls, bound by rank and ritual, had run its course. Divorce was almost unthinkable in Edwardian England. A man needed only proof of adultery. A woman required abandonment, violence, or disgrace. And yet, in 1906, they separated. There was no quarrel, no final scene, just a letter left on her writing desk at Sunderland House. "I believe it is time we consider a formal arrangement." There was no cruelty in it, no insult, just the familiar hand of the Duke, measured, precise, and impersonal. The formal end to a marriage that had long since dissolved. Consuelo did not weep. She did not pace the room. She stood at the window overlooking Grosvenor Square and watched the light fall across the pavement as a nursemaid walked two children toward the park. There was no rupture, she would write later, only a removal, as if a painting had been taken down from a wall, leaving the outline faintly visible behind it. Her fingers curled around the curtain. The fire had not been lit. Her breakfast tray did not come. She'd sent the staff away for the morning. For the first time in years, she chose the quiet. She did not cry. She simply took down the small wedding portrait on her mantel, framed in tortoise shell, posed to perfection, and placed it in a drawer face down. This was not the end of her life. It was merely the beginning. In London, Consuelo's Fridays began to gather those who needed no invitation and bowed to no titles. George Bernard Shaw brought wine. Galsworthy brought opinions. The Webbs came with pamphlets. Yeats with questions. Nancy Astor asked her questions with an eyebrow raised. Lady Cunard arrived with a laugh too loud for her pearls. There were no place cards, no orchestra, no agenda, but conversation. They argued about suffrage and socialism, Irish verse and industrial reform. No one asked about the Duke. No one mentioned Blenheim. They addressed her as Consuelo, not Your Grace, not Madam, just her name. Once, after midnight, as the last guest slipped into the fog, she stood by the empty decanter in the low firelight and thought, "This is what society should feel like, not ceremony, but belonging." Though the court refused to receive separated women, London society came. It was not rebellion, but grace under pressure. But as the music faded and the last applause died, the halls grew quiet again. The children were sent to school. The letters slowed. The echo of the evening lingered, but it was not enough. Not anymore. She had stood on the staircase. Now she needed to climb higher into work that mattered. She found it in Ensley Street. The house smelled of coal, starch, and damp wood. It was a home for the wives of first offenders, women whose husbands had been sent to prison, leaving them behind with children and shame. The church army called it a refuge. Most simply called it temporary. She had come expecting to observe. Instead, a baby was placed in her arms. "He hasn't cried since last week," said one of the matrons, "but he won't sleep either." The child's skin was warm and dry, his limbs stiff. He blinked but did not fuss. She rocked him carefully, awkwardly conscious of her gloves. Consuelo visited the next week, then the week after that. She leased 2 houses. She turned them into sewing rooms, nurseries. The women worked. Their children were cared for. At night, she read them prayers. "We like the Duchess to read to us," one said, "but she always makes us cry." Some clergy approved. Others whispered that she had gone too far, stepping beyond the ornamental bounds of charity into something unsettlingly real. She ignored them. "Mrs. Bellingham, is it true that you once lived in a palace?" a little girl with matchstick arms asked her one evening as she buttoned the child's nightgown. "I did," Consuelo replied. "Was it like in the fairy stories, with golden carriages and servants who bring you anything you want?" Consuelo paused, remembering the cold marble floors, the endless corridors, the silences. "Not quite like the stories," she said. "Sometimes the most beautiful cages are the ones with the strongest bars." The child frowned, not understanding. "Do the princes in the stories ever ask the princesses what they want?" Consuelo asked. The little girl thought hard. "I don't think so." "Exactly," Consuelo smiled. "Real happiness isn't about having someone bring you things. It's about being asked what you want." From charity, she turned to policy. She joined the National Commission on the Declining Birth Rate, the only laywoman among doctors, priests, economists, and eugenicists. Consuelo did not flinch. Beside her sat Dr. Marie Stopes, scandalous, brilliant, unafraid. Her book silenced pulpits. Consuelo sat at the end of the table, perfectly upright, gloved hands folded in her lap. When called upon, she spoke quietly but without hesitation. She described overcrowded tenements, malnourished infants, mothers with no access to medical care. She quoted midwives, school inspectors, and women she had met in the homes. One of the men scoffed. Another, a clergyman known as the Gloomy Dean, frowned. But then Marie Stopes stood. "I believe," she said, "that the Duchess of Marlborough is the only person here speaking from lived truth rather than abstract morality." There was no applause, only silence. Later in her diary, Consuelo wrote, "I had never expected to be heard, only to be counted. Today I was both." By 1907, the press had given her a name, the Working Duchess. At first it felt pointed, almost mocking, but over time it became accurate. If not warm, then at least true. Across the Atlantic, her mother began to write again. Not commands, not corrections, but reflections. "You are becoming what I could not," Alva wrote. "I admire you for it." There was no apology, but something in the spacing of the words felt like release to Consuelo. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer where she had once kept a silver rattle, an ivory fan, and a letter that had set her free. They exchanged news of suffrage speeches and playground campaigns, of prison mothers and Westminster bills. Alva described women chained to iron railings in front of the Capitol. Consuelo wrote of women sewing in silence behind Ensley doors. They were not close, but now they were aligned. In 1908, Consuelo returned to America to give her first public speech for children's needs at the Waldorf Astoria. 700 guests filled the ballroom. Colonel George Harvey urged her forward. She had dreaded it, but duty outweighed fear. She had been announced as a duchess. The crowd expected aristocratic pleasantries. Instead, she spoke of Ensley Street, of cracked teacups, overcrowded lodgings, and mothers who fed their children tea to quiet their hunger. She spoke slowly, her voice low at first, then steadier, firmer. "Dignity is not conferred by title," she said. "It is sustained by recognition." There was a moment's hush at the end, then applause, scattered, then rising, until the room was full of hands and sound. Her marriage had ended, but the silence she'd endured had taught her how to listen, and now she used it to make others heard. She had once been part of a story, now she was beginning to write one. In November 1913, Sunderland House opened its doors to a carefully selected guest list. Bishops in stiff collars, politicians with polished shoes, society women balancing lorgnettes and expectations. They arrived expecting tea and conversation, a graceful morning's nod to charity. What they encountered was something else entirely. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, had summoned them not to flatter, but to confront. With Margaret Lawrence and Gertrude Tuckwell beside her, she presided over a conference designed not to comfort, but to expose. One by one, 12 working women took the stage. A shirtmaker held up a blouse, her fingers tight around the cloth. "A dozen shirts earns 9p," she said. Another spoke, voice clear and unflinching. 8 shillings a week. I've never eaten a dinner that cost more than a penny." No one spoke, no one smiled, and no one, not even the industrialists in the back row, could look away. By the end of the week, 8 additional trades had received legal protection. It was not a riot. It was not a headline. It was something quieter and more subversive. The truth, spoken in the language of suffering, echoing through rooms of carved marble. For Consuelo, it was a moment of clarity and collapse. After a speech in Liverpool, she rode the train home in silence. Her limbs ached, her breath came shallow, a hot water bottle warmed her feet, but still she shook, and as the countryside slipped past in dusk and fog, her thoughts turned inevitably to her mother. Alva Vanderbilt, once her tormentor, had changed. Widowhood had not softened her but redirected her. Alva had hurled herself into the suffrage movement with the same force she had once used to mould a debutante's spine. But this time, the ambition was not personal. It was political. She marched, she funded, she organised, and remarkably she invited Consuelo not as pupil but as partner. Through her, Consuelo met the women who led the charge. Emmeline Pankhurst, fierce beneath lace and bone, Christabel, fire-tongued and defiant, Dr. Anna Shaw, who had once delivered babies and sermons with equal authority. These women had suffered, some had starved, some had bled, and none begged permission. One letter from Alva stayed with her. In response to a New York committee debating how best to rehabilitate courtesans, Alva wrote, "To ask what to do with the young courtesan is to begin in the wrong place. Arrest the men who create the need. Let their guilt fund the women they destroy." It wasn't maternal warmth. It was something fiercer, unvarnished justice. A woman once consumed by status, now advocating for the invisible and discarded. In 1913, Consuelo stood beside her at the International Woman Suffrage Alliance in Budapest, listening to Anna Shaw preach beneath vaulted ceilings. For the first time, their work felt shared, not staged, not rehearsed, but real. Then came war. She had booked passage on the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, set to sail on August 3rd, 1914. On August 2nd, the voyage was cancelled. Warnings rippled through the shipping lines. Routes changed. Neutral flags were hoisted higher. Submarines prowled familiar waters. 3 days later, she boarded a brightly lit American steamer. Other ships passed in darkness, their hulls scrubbed of identity. Her sons were still at Eton. Blandford, barely 17, had already been measured for war. The American Women's War Relief Fund asked her to serve. She said yes. Within months, she led the opening of hospitals in Devon and London. She organised committees, raised funds, and trained women to take up roles left vacant by enlisted men. When proposals arose, Mrs. Whitelaw Reid simply asked, "How much do you need?" and pledged it. By 1915, Sunderland House had become a meeting ground for the war's invisible architects. Her home for prisoners' wives became a maternity annex, 18 beds for unwed mothers, girls carrying more than shame. One of them wept beside her newborn. Her husband, a black American, had left for the front. The baby's pale skin terrified her. A nurse tried to reassure her. Newborns often look pale at birth. His colour will come. But the fear of judgment, abandonment, disbelief remained. In 1916, Consuelo gave the priestly lecture on infant mortality. She did not speak in abstractions. She began with a stark truth. 1 in every 8 children born in Britain dies before their first birthday. In London's poorest boroughs, the toll was worse. Disease ran rampant. Babies were wrapped in newspaper for warmth. Clinics turned away the unmarried. And Consuelo named what others would not: venereal disease, malnutrition, shame. Some in the audience stood and left. The Times called her brave. She launched the Jewel Fund. Give a jewel to save a baby's life. Cartier opened its vaults. Tiaras, tin lockets, wedding bands, Lloyd George's scarf pins sold twice. £50,000 poured in. But money, she learned, was never enough. For every maternity bed she opened, 10 more were needed. For every child she saved, another slipped through the cracks. Charity could soothe but not cure, and the disease was structural. Policies that punished, laws that excluded, lives made invisible. If she wanted to change the rules, she'd need to sit in the room where the rules were written. Politics came next. The major parties offered women no real seat. So she helped found the Women's Municipal Party. No whip, no machine, just women. Widowed, titled, determined. Tired of waiting for someone else's permission, Alva urged her forward. Not as ornament, she said, but as instrument. In 1917, Consuelo ran for London County Council in North Southwark. They deliberated, then chose her. She won again in 1919. Children sang in the streets. Vote, vote, vote for Mrs. Marlborough. Inside the council, she worked on housing, heat, education. She walked the slums and invited the Prince of Wales to join her. He did. "I wish my mother wore hats like yours," he said. But he listened. A disgruntled driver, dismissed for poor performance, began spreading rumours that she owned slum tenements. It was a lie, but damaging. She answered it quietly. No denials, no scandal, just a tram ride to her next public meeting, refusing to stand above those she served. One night, she noticed a man trailing her down a darkened street. Her heart pounded, her pace quickened. So did his. But at her next gathering, when she rose to speak, he stood at the back and applauded. A supporter, it turned out. He had only wanted to ensure she got home safe. Even courage, it seemed, could be mistaken for risk. "You realize," Winston Churchill told her over lunch at the Savoy, "that you're the first American to sit on a British governing body since we rather rudely ejected your lot in 1776. "Not rudely," she smiled. "Justifiably." "Careful, cousin," he winked. "That's treasonous talk." "Only if you still consider me British," she replied. "I'm becoming more American every day." "Nonsense," he grinned. "We'll keep the good ones." Sunderland House had grown cold. No heat, no privacy. 10 housemaids quit. One muttered on her way out, "I thought this was a house. It's a town hall." In 1918, she handed it over. The Inter-Allied Council took possession. Arthur Balfour sent thanks. Paul Cravath took her rooms. Her sons were scattered across the front. Blandford rode with the cavalry in France. Ivor, barred from combat, served in logistics. Her brothers crossed the Atlantic in navy blue. She wrote them all daily, faithfully, never knowing which letter might be the last. Crowhurst took in wounded officers. Its halls echoed with crutches, coughs, and quiet grief. Her parlour became a ward, her garden a vegetable patch. On November 11th, 1918, the siren sounded across London, not in warning, but in wonder. Peace. She stood on the balcony of the County Council building and looked out on a city that had bled for 4 years. Crowds surged, flags unfurled. The air trembled with hymns, with joy, with release. Then the French marched past, shrunken in number, solemn in step. She did not cheer. She wept for Paris, for Verdun, for the boys who did not return, and for the world they left behind. Peace brought no rest. The headlines shifted. The sirens fell silent, but the broken world remained. Slums still festered. Mothers still begged for blankets. Laws still lagged behind the lives they governed. Exhausted in body and spirit, Consuelo withdrew to Alva's villa among citrus groves and Mediterranean light. Alva was older now, slower but no less certain. They sat in the garden, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing letters and wounds. Years of distance and dominance softened into something like tenderness. And in that quiet reconciliation, Consuelo allowed herself, finally, to rest. In 1920, Blandford married Lady Mary Cadogan, daughter of the 5th Earl Cadogan. The wedding took place at St. Margaret's, Westminster, beneath a pale winter sun. The pews were filled with titled names and the shattered remnants of a generation. Consuelo watched her son, the future Duke, stand at the altar, polished, poised, and heartbreakingly young. She blessed the match, but as Mary took her son's arm, a shadow passed, faint, familiar. A girl in white, a door quietly closing. Then came the letter. It arrived in 1921. Brief, elegant, predictable. Sonny wanted a divorce. Gladys would not be a mistress. She would be a duchess. There was no courtroom scene, no scandal in the papers. The divorce was quietly obtained in Paris. Mutual consent, no accusations, no counterclaims. The headlines were courteous. Duke and Duchess part amicably. She moved to a smaller house with ivy on the walls and sunlight in the kitchen. No staff waited in doorways. No footman flanked the stairs. She learned to make her own tea. She sat by the fire in her slippers. And one morning she realized she had not heard her name announced in weeks, and no one had bowed. No one had asked her to smile. No one had called her the Duchess of Marlborough. They had called her Consuelo. Sonny married Gladys Deacon that summer. There was no church wedding, no photographs, just a line in the Times. She read it once, then went for a walk. The sun was warm. The air carried the smell of wet grass and stone. and for the first time in decades, she walked with no destination, no duty, no script. She had been traded for a title. Now she had given it back, and she did not miss it. Unlike your warm, cozy bed now, where you make your own choices, she had spent most of her life living by others' rules, smiling when told, speaking when permitted. But now, at last, she was beginning to find the one thing that had eluded her from the start: freedom. 1920 was shadowed by sorrow. Her father, gravely ill, died with quiet dignity. Consuelo was with him to the end. He bore his suffering without complaint, and when the Duc de Gramont sent condolences on behalf of the French Jockey Club, his words were simple: his death will be a great loss to the French racing world. Letters arrived from every corner: aristocrats, jockeys, stable hands, surgeons. The Paris clinic he had funded mourned deeply. Consuelo had often helped there alongside her stepmother. Now she helped plan the burial. He was laid to rest in the family vault on Staten Island. In the house, where once children had peered down on balls from the upstairs gallery, hymns now echoed through closed doors. She spent long, still weeks in her mother's medieval-style home on Long Island. Alva had helped win the vote. She had become president of the National Woman's Party, but she was alone. Consuelo prepared to begin again. She sold Sunderland House, gave Portman Square to her son, released Crowhurst. Each home carried its own memory, each farewell its own grief, but she knew it was time. Her sons were grown, Blandford happily married, Ivor studying at Oxford. She had given them stability. Now she needed freedom. She moved into the Paris house her father had given her, but his death had ended the companionship she had hoped for. Alva joined her there, and with her Aunt Jenny, they built something soft and quiet. Waiting for the final steps of divorce, Consuelo leased a villa near Aza. She travelled often to England, but did not expect to fall in love. On July 4th, 1921, she married Jacques Balsan in the Chapel Royal of the Savoy at 9 a.m. to avoid reporters. This was quieter, warmer. They followed with a civil ceremony. Colonel George Harvey, American ambassador, and General Cornelius Vanderbilt stood as witnesses. There was no coronet, no throne, but there was peace. Jacques Balsan was beloved everywhere. Kind, clever, brave. Children loved him. So did generals, gardeners, and grand dames. He was, she realized, not a man who needed to impress, but one who knew how to care. Jacques was a pilot, but before planes, he flew balloons. In 1899, he floated from France to Russia, crashing in Prussia and landing at the estate of Baron von Bandemer. He was greeted politely, shown a monument to the French defeat at Sedan, and sent on his way. He bought his first airplane in 1909 and earned pilot license number 18. In Morocco, he flew reconnaissance against the Moors, risking capture and torture. In 1913, he received the Legion of Honor. In World War I, he scouted during the First Battle of the Marne. Later, with Consuelo's father and Dr. Gros, he helped establish the Lafayette Escadrille, precursor to the American Air Force. They had met years before when she was still a newlywed and he a dashing guest at Blenheim. During the war, he had once sent her a postcard before a bombing run. I did not expect to return. Now he had. Unlike the Duke, who saw her as an ornament, Jacques saw her as a partner. What would you like to do? He asked her one morning over breakfast. A question so simple, yet so revolutionary that she nearly dropped her cup. Do? She repeated. Yes, he smiled. With your life. With our life. What would you like to create? No one, not her mother, not her ex-husband, not society, had ever asked. She thought for a moment, then smiled back. Everything. Their marriage was not recognized by the Catholic Church. In France, where Catholicism ruled society, divorce was rare and remarriage without annulment forbidden. Jacques' family, devout and bound to tradition, could not receive her. She asked him not to break with them. She would wait. When in 1926 Marlborough sought his own annulment, the moment came. With the help of her mother and old governess, she petitioned Rome. Her lawyer, Sir Charles Russell, warned that only proof of coercion would suffice. Alva consented as a way to apologize for that action so long ago. She admitted she had forced her daughter unwillingly to marry. The Vatican ruled in Consuelo's favor. No bribes had passed, only courage and truth. Now married in the church, Consuelo was welcomed into the Balsan family. At the chateau in Chaumet, once established by the Prince de Condé, she met them all. Madame Charles Balsan, Jacques' great-aunt, presided in lace and black. She offered Consuelo a golden heirloom box. "We loved him too," she seemed to say. "And now we love you." Later, Consuelo wrote her a letter of thanks. The matriarch read it aloud to the family. It was, she recalled, a moment of true reconciliation. In Paris, she and Jacques made their home near the green lawns of the Champ de Mars. From her window, she watched cavalry officers trot by at dawn. Children played, readers claimed benches. The Seine shimmered, the Eiffel Tower blinked its message to the sky. Their house, designed in 18th century style, was filled with antiques and discoveries from long walks along the quay. Paris life was elegance, but not idleness. Consuelo hosted modest luncheons with literary guests. Edith Wharton visited frequently. She chaired charity events. The British Embassy, once owned by Pauline Borghese, held glittering dinners under Napoleon's gold service. Here, old castes mingled, Bourbon, Bonaparte, Republican. She watched it all with grace and growing understanding. "You know what's strange?" she said to Jacques one evening as they returned from a salon hosted by the Comtesse de Noailles. "I used to think being a duchess was the height of power, but I had no power at all. And now?" he asked, helping her with her coat. "Now I have the only power that matters," she smiled. "The power to choose." In 1926, she was asked to help build a hospital for the middle class, those too proud for charity, too poor for private care. The hilltop site near Suresnes had once belonged to Jean Worth. With Dr. Alexis Carrel and Bernard Flexner, she led the campaign. 360 rooms and a nursing school. Fundraising became fate. Grand Prix dinners, peacock balls, raffles with Fabergé clocks. Musicians clamoured to perform. "I was at your benefit concert," an elderly man in worn clothes told her one afternoon as she inspected the hospital's foundation stones. 40 years ago, I cleaned the stables at Blenheim. You probably don't remember me." She studied his face, weathered like bark. "You're wrong, Mr. Harrison. You had a border collie named Pitch who followed you everywhere." The man's eyes widened. "You remember that?" "I remember everyone who was kind to me," she said. "You let me feed Pitch when no one was looking." He nodded, suddenly shy. "This place you're building, my daughter's expecting her first. They live in 2 rooms, no proper doctor for miles." "She'll have a room here," Consuelo said, touching his arm. "The best care we can give." "Why, though?" he asked. "Why go to all this trouble for people you don't know?" She looked out over the construction site, the men laying foundations in the afternoon sun. "Because I spent half my life as decoration," she said. "I'd rather spend the rest being useful." For many, a Gilded Age socialite possessing a luxurious Parisian mansion and a villa on the Riviera might be more than sufficient. As a former duchess and Vanderbilt heiress, Consuelo was not your garden variety Gilded Age socialite. Having relocated to France, she needed a country place within easy reach of Paris. To that end, in 1922, Jacques and Consuelo purchased and restored Château Saint-Georges Motel, an early 17th century manor near Dreux in Normandy. The chateau was a resurrection project. Neglected for decades, its roof leaked, its gardens had surrendered to wilderness, its windows stared blankly into nothing. "It's a disaster," the real estate agent warned. "Completely uninhabitable." Jacques laughed. So was Blenheim, and they called that a palace. They worked side by side, hiring local craftsmen, sourcing materials, replanting the gardens. Unlike Blenheim, with its armies of servants and rigid protocols, St. George Motel became a place of creation. "I never knew you could hang curtains," Jacques teased, watching her measure a window. "I never knew I could either," she admitted. "It's delightful to find out." Consuelo continued her charitable endeavours there, establishing a sanatorium for children and founding a hospital nearby. Winston and Clementine Churchill were regular guests. The chateau became their sanctuary, a place where titled guests mixed with artists, where conversation flowed without protocol, where children were welcome at the table. "I've been thinking," she told Jacques one evening as they sat in the garden, watching the sun melt into the horizon. Bees hummed in the lavender, the air smelled of wild thyme and warm stone. "A dangerous pastime," he teased. "I want to start a summer camp here. For city children who never see trees or clean air." He nodded. "How many?" 50 to start. We'll need to build cabins, hire teachers." "Done," he said simply. She looked at him, this man who never questioned her dreams, only asked how to help realize them. "Just like that?" "Just like that," he smiled. "I trust your heart." That summer, the grounds of St. Georges Motel filled with laughter as children from Paris tenements discovered forests and streams, ate fresh food, slept under quiet skies. Consuelo walked among them, not as a duchess or a Vanderbilt, but as someone who remembered what it meant to be caged, to be hungry for space and sky. A small boy with hollow cheeks tugged at her skirt one afternoon. "Madame Balsan, is it true you used to live in a castle bigger than this whole place?" "I did," she nodded. "Were you happy there?" She considered his question, its directness, its innocence. "No," she said simply, "I wasn't." "But you're rich," he frowned. "My papa says rich people are always happy." She knelt to his level, met his eyes. Being rich isn't the same as being free, and only free people have a chance at happiness. He nodded solemnly, though she knew he didn't fully understand. Not yet, but he would remember her words someday when they might matter. She loved Paris most in the spring. Acacia blossoms opened toward the light. The Seine shimmered. Old men fished without expectation. The world, for a time, appeared content. But outside the salons and sun-drenched afternoons, shadows were lengthening. France was restless. The strikes grew louder, the workers more defiant. Though she did not fear them, she could feel something shifting, something solemn gathering on the horizon. In the summer of 1930, they began building a villa at Aisy-sur-Mer, collaborating with Achille Duchesne, a landscape architect who had designed the water gardens at Blenheim Palace. Consuelo and Jacques both took an active role in the design. Inspired by the 11th century convent of Le Thoronay, the building was a monastery with a cloister used as a winter garden, bell tower, and chapel. Furniture was shipped from Crowhurst to help furnish the home. There were petit-point chairs fit for kings, but one sat in them unmolested, she later described in her memoir. Beautiful Isfahan rugs covered the floors, and the house was gay with flowers. Unlike Blenheim, where every object was a statement of status, every room a stage for display, Villa A's was designed for living. Windows opened to the Mediterranean, terraces invited long lunches, books lay casually open, waiting to be continued. It was here, watching the sea change from turquoise to indigo, that Consuelo began to write her memoirs. Not for publication, not yet, but for understanding. "I've been wondering," Jacques said one evening as they sat on the terrace, the sunset turning the water to hammered gold, "why you never talk about your years at Blenheim." She sipped her wine, watched a sailboat tack against the wind. "Some wounds," she said carefully, "are best left undisturbed. Or perhaps," he suggested, "some need air to heal properly." She considered this. "Are you suggesting I write it down?" "I'm suggesting you own it," he said. "All of it. The girl who was sold, the woman who survived, the duchess who walked away. It's a story worth telling. Who would want to read about a poor little rich girl?" She smiled ruefully. "Anyone who's ever felt trapped," he said. "Anyone who's ever wanted to be more than what others decided they should be." The next day she began writing in earnest. Not just notes, but a narrative. Her narrative. The years passed in a rhythm of their own making. Winters at Villa A's, spring and autumn at St. George Motel, summers travelling or hosting house parties. Their circle widened, then contracted, then widened again. Artists, diplomats, writers, musicians. Charlie Chaplin visited, charming everyone. The Maharaja of Kapurthala brought stories of India that made her see her own time there through new eyes. They were not untouched by the crash of 1929. Investments suffered, economies tightened, but unlike many of their friends, they did not panic. "We have more than enough," Jacques assured her, "and what we have, we share." The sanatorium remained open. The hospital continued its work. Children still came to St. George Motel each summer, now with thinner faces, shabbier clothes, greater need. In 1933, Alva died in her sleep. There were no trumpets, no suffrage banners, just a short notice, a modest funeral at the American Cathedral in Paris. Maggie Stevenson arranged it with tact and devotion. Consuelo wore black. She did not cry. She did not need to. The grief had come years earlier, in the partings that had hurt more than any passing. She sat near the front. The lilies on the casket were pale and unscented. The marble beneath her shoes was colder than it should have been. No one called Alva a villain that day, nor a heroine, only a name, a date, a pause. But Consuelo felt it, not just the loss of a mother, but the end of the scaffolding on which her life had once been built. The last great tower of her childhood had fallen, and she was still standing. "She taught me strength," she would later write, "but it was forgiveness that let me carry it." They returned to St. George Motel after the funeral. Jacques poured brandy, built a fire, though the evening was mild. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind only possible between people who have nothing left to hide. "Do you think," she asked finally, "she ever regretted what she did, forcing me to marry Sonny?" Jacques considered his answer carefully. "I think," he said, "she regretted her methods but not her goals. She wanted you to have power, security, position. She didn't understand that those things without choice are just another form of prison." Consuelo nodded, watching the flames dance. "She helped with the annulment. That was something." "That was everything," Jacques corrected gently. "It was her way of giving you back what she had taken." They sat together as the fire burned low. Outside, an owl called across the parkland. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds held space for what had been lost and what had been found. The shadow of another war began to stretch across Europe, first as whispers, then as headlines, then as marching boots and raised voices. They read the papers, listened to the radio, watched the changing faces around them. Friends returning to Germany suddenly stopped writing. Czech acquaintances spoke in worried tones. Polish diplomats cancelled visits. In Paris, refugees began arriving. First a trickle, then a stream. Writers, artists, musicians, scientists, Jews, socialists, homosexuals, intellectuals, anyone deemed undesirable by the new order rising in the East. Consuelo and Jacques opened their doors, not just to the titled or famous, but to anyone who needed shelter, a meal, a moment to breathe before continuing the journey. "We can't save everyone," Jacques warned as their guest list grew. "No," she agreed, "but we can save some, and that's not nothing." Their work at the hospital took on new urgency. They added beds, trained more nurses, stockpiled medical supplies. Without speaking it aloud, they prepared for what they both knew was coming. In the summer of 1939, they spent long days at St. George Motel. The children's camp continued, though many parents kept their children close that year. Those who came were thinner, quieter, their eyes older than their years. Winston Churchill visited in August, painting the chateau in the summer light. His brushstrokes were broad, confident, capturing the golden stone against the green backdrop. But his conversation was grave. "It's coming," he told them over dinner on the terrace. "Not a question of if, only when." "And England?" Jacques asked. "Will fight," Churchill said simply. "Must fight." "And France?" Consuelo asked, though she already knew the answer. Churchill looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Will fall," he said quietly. "Not because Frenchmen lack courage, but because their leaders lack vision." They did not argue. They had seen the divisions, the political paralysis, the failure to prepare. That night, after Churchill retired, they walked in the garden under a sky brilliant with stars. "We should go to America," Jacques said, "before it's too late. And leave all this." She gestured to the chateau, the gardens, the hospital they had built, the lives they had touched. "If necessary," he nodded, "things can be rebuilt. Lives cannot." She knew he was right, but still she hesitated. "This is our home." "Home," he said gently, "is wherever we are together." They made plans quietly, carefully, not in panic, but in practicality. American passports were updated, funds were transferred, arrangements were made for staff, for patients, for the children in their care. They told no one, not wanting to spread fear, but they watched and waited, ready to move when the moment came. In May 1940, that moment arrived with brutal swiftness. The Germans broke through at Sedan. The French army collapsed. Refugees clogged the roads south. They were at St. George Motel when news came that Paris would fall. There was no time for sentiment, only for survival. They packed one car with essentials, clothes, documents, medicines, a few treasured photographs. Jacques brought maps, cash, his pilot's instincts for navigation. As they prepared to leave, a young mother appeared at their door, two small children clinging to her skirts. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're looking for my husband. He's Jewish. We have nowhere to go." Consuelo looked at Jacques. He nodded without hesitation. "You'll come with us," she told the woman. "We'll find a way." The children were squeezed into the back seat, wide-eyed and silent. The mother sat between them, holding their hands. As they drove away, Consuelo looked back at St. George Motel, its windows reflecting the morning sun, its gardens in full bloom. She did not know if she would ever see it again. "I left Blenheim without a backward glance," she told Jacques, as the chateau disappeared around a bend in the road. "Why does this hurt so much more?" "Because Blenheim was never yours," he said simply. "This was." They joined the exodus south, a river of humanity flowing away from the advancing German army. Cars, carts, bicycles, people on foot carrying whatever they could. The roads were choked. What should have been a 6-hour journey took 3 days. They slept in the car, shared their food with fellow refugees, helped push vehicles that ran out of fuel. The woman and her children, her name was Sophie, her boys Thomas and Michelle, remained quiet, watchful, as if afraid that making any sound might bring disaster upon them all. At a checkpoint, a French officer examined their papers with weary eyes. "Balsan," he said, recognition flickering. "The aviator," Jacques nodded. The officer glanced at Consuelo, then at Sophie and the children. Something passed between the men, an understanding. "Go through," he said, handing back their documents. Quickly, they reached the Châteauroux, where a friend had a house in the war zone. The place was a sanctuary in chaos, a moment of pause in the headlong flight. Sophie put her children to bed in a real room with clean sheets. They fell asleep instantly, exhausted by fear and motion. "Thank you," she told Consuelo as they sat in the kitchen drinking tea that tasted of normalcy. "I don't know what would have happened to us." "Don't thank me yet," Consuelo said. "We're not safe. None of us are." "But you didn't have to help us," Sophie insisted. "You could have saved yourselves." Consuelo thought of all the people who had never helped her when she was trapped, of all the doors that had remained closed, of all the voices that had remained silent. "Actually," she said, "we did have to help. That's what being human means." The next day, they continued south, aiming for the Spanish border. If they could reach Spain, they could reach Portugal. If they could reach Portugal, they could find passage to America. But Spain was not welcoming refugees, especially not Jewish ones. They would need to cross the Pyrenees on foot, through mountain passes guarded by both German and Spanish patrols. Jacques knew people, fellow pilots, resistance fighters already organizing. Arrangements were made, guides were found, money changed hands. They abandoned the car, taking only what they could carry. Sophie's boys were too young to walk far, so Jacques carried Thomas on his shoulders while Consuelo took turns with Sophie carrying Michelle. The mountain path was steep, treacherous in the summer heat. They moved only at night, hiding during the day in shepherds' huts or caves or dense forest. On the third night, they heard dogs barking in the distance. Patrols. They froze, holding their breath. Michelle whimpered, and Sophie quickly covered his mouth with her hand. The barking grew louder, then fainter. The patrol had turned another way. They continued, every step a victory against fear, against the forces that sought to destroy lives deemed unworthy. When they finally crossed into Spain, there was no celebration, only exhaustion and the knowledge that they were still far from safe. From Spain to Portugal, from Portugal to a ship bound for New York. Each stage of the journey brought new challenges, new papers to procure, new bribes to pay, new officials to convince. But they had resources others did not. Money, connections, American passports. And they used every advantage, not just for themselves, but for Sophie and her boys and for others they met along the way. "I never thought," Sophie told Consuelo one night on the ship, as they watched the endless Atlantic, "that I would be saved by a duchess." Consuelo smiled. "I'm not a duchess anymore, just a woman who remembers what it's like to be trapped." As the ship approached New York Harbor, Consuelo stood on deck in the early morning light. The skyline emerged from the mist, the Statue of Liberty holding her torch against the dawn. She had left America as a teenage bride, sold for a title. She returned as a woman who had built hospitals, saved lives, found love on her own terms. "Full circle," Jacques said, coming to stand beside her at the rail. "Not quite," she corrected. "Circles end where they begin. I'm not the same person who left." "No," he agreed, taking her hand. "You're much more." Behind them, Sophie and her boys came on deck, their faces turned toward the approaching land of safety. "What will we do in America?" Sophie asked, her voice uncertain. "We'll survive," Consuelo said simply, "and then we'll help others do the same." As the ship docked and the passengers prepared to disembark, Consuelo thought of all the journeys that had brought her to this moment, from Fifth Avenue to Blenheim, from London to Paris, from war to peace, and back to war again. Each step had shaped her, each challenge had strengthened her, each loss had taught her what mattered and what did not. Now, as she prepared to begin yet another chapter, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was finally, truly free. America was not as Consuelo remembered it. The country that had sent her away in silks and jewels now received her as a refugee, one among thousands fleeing a burning Europe. But unlike most who arrived with nothing, she came with resources, connections, and a fierce determination to help those less fortunate. They settled first with her brother Willie on Long Island. His home, sprawling and secure, offered a moment to breathe, to take stock, to plan their next move. Sophie and her boys were given a cottage on the grounds. Jacques helped the boys build model airplanes. Consuelo taught Sophie English. In the evenings, they listened to war news on the radio, marking maps with pins, watching Europe disappear beneath the Nazi tide. "I keep thinking about St. George Motel," Consuelo told Jacques one night as they walked along the shore. "The children who came to our camp, the hospital, what's happening to them all?" "Some will survive," he said. "Some won't. We did what we could." "It doesn't feel like enough." He took her hand. "It never does." The Red Cross asked for her help coordinating relief efforts for France. She said yes without hesitation. Her fluent French, her connections on both sides of the Atlantic, her experience managing large-scale projects during the previous war, all made her invaluable. She established an office in Manhattan, gathered volunteers, organized shipments of medical supplies and food. She wrote letters, made calls, pulled strings. She used every connection, every favor owed, every resource at her disposal. Mrs. Balsan, a young volunteer, asked one day, "Is it true you used to be a duchess?" Consuelo looked up from a stack of invoices. "A lifetime ago," she said, "but you gave it up." "I didn't give up anything worth keeping." The woman nodded slowly. "My fiancé is in the Pacific. Everyone says I should wait for him, that it's my duty." "Do you love him?" Consuelo asked. "I thought I did. Now I'm not sure." Consuelo set down her pen. "The only duty that matters is the one you owe yourself. Everything else is just other people's expectations." As the war intensified, news from France grew sparse. St. George Motel had been requisitioned by German officers. Villa Aise was occupied. The hospital continued to operate, but under strict German supervision. Friends disappeared. Letters went unanswered. Rumours filtered through Switzerland of arrests, deportations, executions. Jacques received word that several of his fellow pilots from the Lafayette Escadrille had joined the resistance. Some had already been captured, tortured, killed. "Should we have stayed?" he asked Consuelo one night. "Should we have fought?" "We are fighting," she said, "just not with guns." Through the French Relief Fund, they raised millions of dollars, sending aid through neutral channels, supporting underground networks, helping refugees establish new lives in America. Sophie's husband was among those they helped locate and extract. A mathematician who had worked at the Sorbonne, he had escaped to unoccupied France, then to Portugal. The reunion at the pier in New York was a moment of pure joy amid so much darkness. "You saved my family," he told Consuelo, his voice breaking. "How can I ever repay you?" "Live well," she said simply. "That's payment enough." In 1942, they decided to move south. The Long Island winters were harsh, and Jacques' health was showing signs of strain. They found property in Manalapan, just south of Palm Beach, Florida. Records show that in 1942, Consuelo built a house there designed by architect Maurice Fatio. Named Casa Alva, in honor of her mother, the 26,000-square-foot mansion became their wartime haven. Unlike the palaces of her past, Casa Alva was designed for comfort, not show. The rooms were airy, the furnishings chosen for beauty and utility rather than pedigree. The gardens stretched to the water, filled with tropical flowers and fruit trees. Local children were invited to swim in the pool, to picnic on the lawn. Veterans convalescing at nearby hospitals came for weekend retreats. The house hummed with activity, with purpose. "I never thought I'd build another big house," she told Jacques as they watched the construction. "After Blenheim, I swore I was done with palaces." "This isn't a palace," he corrected. "It's a workshop." And so it proved to be. The East Wing became headquarters for her wartime relief efforts. The ballroom hosted fundraisers for bonds, for the Red Cross, for refugee organizations. The kitchen produced thousands of meals for local service members. In 1943, she was approached by Stuart Preston, an art critic for the New York Times. "I believe," he said over tea on the terrace, "that your story deserves to be told." She raised an eyebrow. "My story? The American duchess who walked away, the heiress who chose freedom over a crown. It's a narrative for our times." She sipped her tea, considering. Why would anyone care about the troubles of a rich woman? Because your struggles, despite the gilded setting, are fundamentally human, and because your journey from decoration to determination offers hope. She agreed to consider it. That night she brought out the journals she had begun at Villa A's, the pages filled with memories she had excavated carefully, painfully, over years. "Should I?" she asked Jacques. "Would it serve any purpose?" "That depends," he said, "on what purpose you want it to serve." "I don't want vengeance or validation, but perhaps perspective. A reminder that even the most gilded cage is still a cage." He nodded. "Then tell it, all of it, the pain and the triumph." She began working with Preston, shaping her journals into a narrative. They worked in the mornings, when her mind was sharpest. Afternoons were still devoted to war work, to correspondence, to organizing aid. The process was not easy. Excavating old wounds, reliving old humiliations, recognizing her own complicity in her confinement, all required a courage different from what had carried her through those years. "I was so young," she said one morning, setting down her pen. "So completely unprepared for what they asked of me. And yet you survived," Preston reminded her. "Not just survived, but emerged stronger." In the spring of 1944, news began to shift. The Allies landed in Normandy. Paris was liberated. The tide turned. Reports filtered in about St. Georges Motel. The chateau had been used as German headquarters, then as a field hospital. It was damaged but standing. The gardens were destroyed, the furnishings looted, but the walls remained. Villa A's had fared worse. Occupied first by Italians, then by Germans, it had been heavily damaged in fighting as the Allies pushed up from the south. The Foch Hospital had survived, operating throughout the occupation. The staff had hidden wounded resistance fighters, Jewish children, Allied airmen shot down over France. Some had been caught, deported, executed. Others had maintained their secret work until liberation. "We'll rebuild," Jacques promised. "When this is over, we'll go back and make it whole again." She nodded, but they both knew that some things, once broken, could never be fully restored. In the fall of 1945, the war ended. Europe lay in ruins. Millions were dead, millions more displaced. The world had changed fundamentally, and so had they. They were American now, not just by passport, but by choice. Their lives, their work, their future was here. They maintained their connections to France, sent aid for reconstruction, supported the hospital through its rebuilding, but they did not return to live. "I've had enough of empires falling," Consuelo said when asked why. "I prefer to be where things are being built, not where they're crumbling." Her sons visited when they could. Blandford, now the 10th Duke of Marlborough, brought his family to Casa Alva. The grandchildren filled the house with laughter, with future. Ivor, her younger son, came more often. He had never felt the weight of title and expectation as heavily as his brother. He and Jacques became close, sharing a love of flying, of adventure. In these years of relative peace, Consuelo continued her work with local hospitals, with children's charities, with cultural institutions. She served on boards, raised funds, lent her name and time to causes she believed in. But increasingly she turned inward, to reflection, to writing, to the pleasure of a life lived on her own terms. The memoir took shape slowly, carefully. She was determined to be honest but not cruel, reflective but not bitter. She wanted to tell the truth of her experience without condemning those who had shaped it. "What will you call it?" Jacques asked one evening as she reviewed the manuscript. She thought for a moment. "The glitter and the gold." "Perfect," he nodded. "Which was which?" She smiled. "That's for the reader to decide." When the book was finally published in 1953, it caused a sensation. For 8 months, it remained on the New York Times bestseller list. Critics praised its candor, its insight, its elegant restraint. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan has given us not just a memoir, but a mirror, wrote one reviewer. In her story, we see reflected the changing status of women, the fading of aristocratic power, the emergence of American influence, and most poignantly, one woman's journey from object to agent. Letters arrived from around the world, women who had made similar journeys from constraint to freedom, men who had never considered the price of female compliance, young people inspired by her courage to make their own choices. "I never expected such a response," she told Jacques as they sorted through the mail. "I thought it would be dismissed as the complaints of a privileged woman." "People recognize truth," he said simply. "And yours is universal." She received invitations to speak, to lecture, to advise. She accepted some, declined others. She had no interest in becoming a celebrity or a symbol. She had been a symbol once before, and the experience had nearly erased her. In 1946, she and Winnaretta Singer, the Princesse de Polignac, decided to sell Renoir's Le Moulin de la Galette to fund French children's relief efforts. The painting, which had hung in their Paris salon, brought a substantial sum. "Art for life," Consuelo said when asked about the sale. "It seems a fair exchange." Throughout these years, she and Jacques maintained a rhythm of quiet contentment. Winters at Casa Alva, summers in cooler climates. They travelled when they wished, entertained when they chose, lived according to no calendar but their own. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked her once as they watched the sunset from their terrace. "The pageantry? The palaces, the title?" She considered the question seriously, as she did all his questions. "I miss certain moments," she said finally, "certain people, certain places, but not the life itself. It was beautiful but hollow, like a perfect shell with nothing inside." As the years passed, their circle naturally contracted. Old friends died, family members passed away, the world moved on from war to Cold War, from aristocracy to democracy, from empires to independence. They read the papers, followed world events, maintained their interests, but increasingly they found contentment in smaller pleasures, a perfect rose in the garden, a letter from a grandchild, an evening of good conversation with close friends. "I never expected this," she told him one night, as they sat on the terrace, watching stars emerge over the ocean. "When I walked down that aisle at St. Thomas, I thought my life was over. I never imagined all that would come after." Life, he said, has a way of surprising us. In 1956, the shadows returned. Ivor, her beloved younger son, was diagnosed with a brain tumour. The prognosis was poor from the start. He declined rapidly, his bright spirit dimming by degrees. She went to him in England, sat by his bedside, held his hand. They spoke of childhood, of memories, of things that mattered and things that did not. "I've been thinking about Blenheim," he said one afternoon, his voice weak but his mind still clear. "How strange that such beauty could contain so much unhappiness." "Beauty without love," she said, "is just decoration." He nodded. "You taught me that, not in words, but in how you lived." When he died, she remained composed, dignified in her grief. She had learned long ago not to break in public, not to show the depth of her pain. But alone with Jacques, she allowed herself to crumble, to rage, to weep for the boy who had once been her secret joy in a house of rules and silence. "It's not fair," she sobbed. "He was the gentle one, the kind one." Jacques held her, rocked her, let her grief flow without trying to stem it. "No," he agreed. "It's not fair. Nothing about death ever is." They buried Ivor in the churchyard at Bladen, near Blenheim. The service was small, private, attended by family and close friends. The Duke of Marlborough, her son John, stood beside her, equally broken, for a moment as they watched the coffin lowered into the ground. The years fell away. They were not former spouses, not Duke and ex-Duchess, but simply parents united in the most terrible of losses. Less than 2 months after Ivor's death, another blow fell. Jacques, who had seemed indestructible despite his years, became ill. It began with fatigue, with shortness of breath, symptoms they both attributed to grief, to age, to the humid Florida summer, but it progressed quickly. Alarmingly, doctors were called, tests were run, diagnoses were made, treatments prescribed. None made a difference. "Don't look so worried," he told her one morning as she adjusted his pillows. "I've had a good run." "It's not long enough," she protested. He took her hand, his grip still strong though his body was failing. "We've had 35 years, he said. "That's 35 more than we might have had if you'd made different choices." She sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, memorizing the lines of his face, the shape of his hands, everything that made him Jacques. "I don't regret a single day," she said. "Nor I," he smiled. "Not even the ones when you were being stubborn." "I'm never stubborn," she replied, the familiar teasing comfortable even now. "I'm determined." "Ah, yes," he chuckled weakly. "My mistake." In his final days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. When lucid, he spoke to her of practical matters, finances, properties, arrangements. When dreaming, he spoke in French, called out to old comrades, relived flights over Morocco, over France, over war and peace. She never left his side. She fed him when he could eat, gave him water when he could drink, held his hand when that was all she could do. On a clear October morning in 1956, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the scent of gardenias drifting in from the garden, Jacques Balzan took his final breath. Consuelo, who had survived the loss of freedom, of dignity, of identity, now faced the loss of the one person who had truly seen her, not as an heiress or a duchess or a symbol, but simply as herself. She did not collapse. She did not shatter. She had learned over decades how to bear unbearable things. She arranged the funeral, received friends, answered condolence letters. She maintained the routines of life, meals, correspondence, charity meetings. She went through the motions of living while grief worked its slow, her own power. Few understand what it cost her to stand so straight, to smile so correctly, to play her role so perfectly. But some sense it. Some look at her face and recognize a kindred spirit across the decades, someone who knew what it meant to be valued for appearance rather than essence, for status rather than self. She looks like she's got secrets, a teenage girl observed to her mother during a palace tour in 2018. Like she knows stuff no one else does. Her mother studied the portrait. I think you're right. I think she saw through it all. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world, forcing people into isolation, confining them within their homes, Consuelo's memoir found yet another audience. Readers discovered in her story of confinement and eventual liberation a resonance with their own restricted circumstances, their own longing for freedom. Or reading about someone who spent years in a gilded cage makes our own lockdowns more bearable, wrote one reviewer. If Consuelo Vanderbilt could endure decades of constraint and emerge with her humanity not just intact but enlarged, surely we can manage a few months. Her story spoke to something fundamental, the human need for autonomy, for authentic connection, for purpose beyond mere existence. In every generation, in every circumstance, these needs reassert themselves, making her journey as relevant in the 21st century as it had been in the 20th. In a world increasingly dominated by surfaces, by carefully curated social media images, by wealth displayed rather than shared, by appearance valued over substance, Consuelo's rejection of glitter in favor of gold offers a necessary corrective, a reminder of what truly matters. If she were here now, what would she make of our world? Would she recognize the patterns she had fought against, the constraints she had overcome? Would she see progress in women's lives, or merely more subtle forms of limitation? Perhaps she would point out that cages come in many forms, not just marriages arranged for status or wealth, but also lives arranged around others' expectations, others' definitions of success, others' visions of what constitutes a worthy life. Perhaps she would remind us that freedom is never simply given but must be claimed, often at great cost, that finding one's authentic self requires courage, requires persistence, requires the willingness to disappoint others in order to be true to oneself. Or perhaps she would simply smile that composed, slightly enigmatic smile captured in photographs from her later years, the smile of a woman who had seen through the illusions of her time, who had paid the price of truth and who had found it worth every penny. In one of her last interviews, given to a women's magazine in 1960, Consuelo was asked what advice she would give to young women facing difficult choices. "Trust your own compass," she said. "The world will offer you many maps, many directions. Some will promise security, some excitement, some approval. But only you can know which path leads toward your true self. And only by following that path, however uncertain it seems, can you find genuine fulfillment." Then she added, with the slight knowing smile that had become her hallmark, "And remember that it's never too late to change direction. I was 43 when I began my real life. Some begin at 20, some at 60. The only failure is never beginning at all." This, perhaps, is her most enduring legacy. Not the hospitals built or the memoirs written or the charities founded, but this essential wisdom distilled from a life of extraordinary contrasts. The wisdom of a woman who had inhabited both prison and freedom, both glitter and gold, and who knew the difference at a soul level. In 2022, a letter surfaced in a private collection written by Consuelo to a friend in 1962, 2 years before her death. In it, she reflected on her long, complicated journey. Looking back, she wrote, "I see that everything, even the painful parts, perhaps especially those, had purpose. The cage taught me the value of freedom. The silence taught me the power of voice. The emptiness taught me to recognize fullness when it finally came. I was fortunate," she continued, "not in the ways the world thought, the wealth, the title, the palaces, but in finding my way, eventually, to what mattered, to work that served others, to love freely given and received, to the peace that comes from living in harmony with one's true nature. If I could tell my younger self anything," she concluded, "it would be this. The path is longer and harder than you can imagine, but what waits at the end is worth every step. Keep walking, keep hoping, keep believing in the possibility of a life that is truly your own. It exists, I promise." In a world that still often values women more for appearance than action, more for compliance than courage, her promise remains a beacon, a reminder that transformation is possible, that authentic selfhood can be reclaimed, that even the most gilded cage cannot contain the human spirit indefinitely. So, as the lights dim on Consuelo's story, as we prepare to leave her to her hard-won peace, perhaps we can carry forward something of her journey. Perhaps we can recognize the cages in our own lives, the expectations that constrain us, the fears that confine us, the illusions that distract us from what truly matters. Perhaps we can find in her example the courage to ask the essential questions. What is real beneath the glitter? What truly nourishes the soul? What constitutes a life well lived? And perhaps, like Consuelo, we can discover that the answers often lie not in acquisition but in contribution, not in status but in service, not in being admired but in being authentic. For in the end, her story is not just about a dollar princess who became a duchess, who became herself. It is about the universal human journey from constraint to freedom, from role to soul, from living others' definitions to defining life on one's own terms. It is a journey we are all invited to make, regardless of era or circumstance. A journey that begins with the recognition that the most beautiful cage is still a cage, and ends with the discovery that true fulfillment lies not in conforming to others' expectations, but in becoming who we most deeply are. As Consuelo wrote in the final pages of her memoir, "The glitter fades, it always does, but the gold, the true gold of human connection, of meaningful work, of authentic selfhood that endures, that remains when all else is dust." And so we leave her, this woman of many names and many lives, Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, Mrs. Jacques Balsan, finally at peace beneath the quiet English sky, having completed her remarkable journey from object to subject, from possession to person, from someone else's story to the author of her own life. Her grave is simple, unadorned, a stark contrast to the palaces and mansions that once defined her, but perhaps that simplicity is the most fitting monument of all, for in the end she discovered what so many seek and so few find, that true wealth has nothing to do with money, true nobility nothing to do with titles, and true happiness nothing to do with others' approval. She discovered, in short, the difference between glitter and gold, and in sharing that discovery through her life, her work, and her words, she left behind a legacy more valuable than all the Vanderbilt millions, a legacy of courage, of transformation, of the radical possibility of beginning again, no matter how the story starts. Unlike the steel rod that once shaped Consuelo's spine, you can sink deeper into your pillow now, letting her story settle around you like a gentle blanket. The journey from constraint to freedom that took her decades can visit you in dreams, reminding you that even the most gilded cage cannot contain the human spirit forever. Rest now, knowing that somewhere beyond the glitter, the true